I came to a bachelorette party, but I was not welcome there. I baked cupcakes for the wedding that no one wanted. And then I saw who my husband and I were seated with at the table, and I almost broke down. My mother-in-law, Karen, asked me if I could bake a selection of gluten-free and dairy-free cakes for the wedding of her daughter, Amber, who at the time I considered a distant but cordial sister-in-law. I run a small home-based baking business that specializes in allergy-friendly recipes, mostly because I've lived with food sensitivities my whole life, and so has my husband's niece, the sweet little girl who was supposed to be the flower girl at the wedding. When Karen approached me, she framed it like a heartfelt family favor, knowing that I understood how hard it is to find baked goods that are both safe and delicious for people with food restrictions. Out of kindness, and because it was family, I agreed. Not once did I mention my standard fees or require a deposit. I believed that since we were talking about a wedding, someone would at least provide basic details. Designs, colors, flavors, guest count, any kind of reference photo. But none of that came. Karen never followed up, never sent a single picture or note, and despite casually mentioning how much she appreciated me doing this, she never once discussed payment. I assumed she was just distracted with the chaos of wedding planning, but something about it sat uneasy in my stomach. Still, I kept telling myself it was a favor, a gesture of goodwill, and surely they wouldn't take advantage of me, at least not intentionally. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first real warning sign came just before Amber's bachelorette weekend, when the group was heading to a rental house a few hours away for a little getaway. I hadn't expected to be a major part of it, but I was told I could join for the daytime festivities, even though I wasn't invited to stay overnight because, according to Amber, there weren't enough beds. It stung a little, but I brushed it off, assuming it was just a logistics issue and not anything personal. Then, the night before I was supposed to drive out, Karen called me unexpectedly. At first, her tone was overly sweet, the kind that always made me feel like she was trying too hard to sound casual. She launched into a whole speech about how she was worried about me making the drive. She reminded me that I didn't have a driver's license, which wasn't even true anymore, and then she said something about how my car wasn't reliable enough for that kind of trip, which caught me off guard because she had never even seen my car. Then she added that the road was really long and winding, and maybe it just wasn't worth the trouble for me to make the drive out there, just for a few hours. I sat there holding the phone, piecing it together in real time, realizing that this wasn't concern, it was dismissal, dressed up as politeness. She didn't want me there. They didn't. And instead of being honest, she was trying to quietly push me out under the pretense of keeping me safe. That was the first moment I started wondering if this whole wedding thing wasn't just an oversight, but a pattern, one I had been too trusting to recognize. Determined not to let the subtle exclusion keep me away, I found a simple solution that felt fair to everyone. My friend offered to drive me, and we decided we'd book a room at a nearby hotel so I wouldn't have to worry about transportation or accommodations. I thought it was a reasonable compromise, and honestly, I was still trying to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. So I messaged Amber to let her know about the plan, asking if it would be alright to bring my friend along just for the daytime activities. I explained everything clearly, that we'd stay off-site, we wouldn't impose, and my friend would just hang out casually so I wouldn't be alone for the trip. There was no response. No sure, no sorry, not ideal, not even a quick, let me check. Just silence. I waited a full day thinking maybe she was just busy, maybe it had slipped her mind. Then the morning of the event came and I still hadn't heard anything. I felt awkward and anxious, but I didn't want to back down, especially after arranging everything. So I sent a follow-up message, short and polite, saying that we were on our way and would see them soon. I didn't get a reply then either. Nothing. Just a long stretch of road ahead of us and this gnawing feeling in my chest that I wasn't really welcome, no matter how hard I tried to show up. When we finally arrived at the venue, I remember standing there for a few moments, watching everyone laugh and drink on the patio, expecting at least a small wave or a nod of acknowledgement. But no one turned toward me. No one walked over. It was as if I had stepped into a private party wearing invisibility. My friend and I lingered near the edge of the group, unsure of whether to walk up or wait, and I kept checking my phone, expecting Amber or Karen to message me any minute with something like, "So glad you made it." But that message never came. We waited over an hour and a half to be exact, before Karen's name finally popped up on my phone screen. I picked it up, relieved, expecting her familiar voice, even if it was tense or awkward. But it wasn't Karen. It was one of Amber's bridesmaids, someone I barely knew, who didn't even bother to introduce herself. Her tone was flat, clipped, like she was doing a chore she didn't want to be assigned. She said, "Hi, so, some of the girls are feeling uncomfortable." It's just that there are strangers here and this was supposed to be a really tight group. She emphasized the word tight, like I was supposed to understand I didn't belong. I stood there in silence, staring at the lake in front of the house, my stomach sinking like a stone. They hadn't forgotten me. They had simply chosen to ignore me, to wait me out, and when I didn't go away, they sent someone else to do their dirty work. I thanked her, hung up, and for a few long seconds just stared at my phone like maybe I had misheard. But I hadn't. They had planned this all along. We drove home in silence for most of the ride, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a stone lodged in my chest. I stared out the window, trying not to cry, trying to tell myself it wasn't personal, but everything in my heart knew that it was. There had been no mix-up, no scheduling error, no moment of misunderstanding. I was simply unwanted, and the coldness of it all felt so deliberate that it made my skin crawl. My friend kept glancing at me, offering quiet reassurances, but I could barely respond. I felt small, humiliated, and foolish for ever thinking I'd been invited in good faith. When we finally pulled into my driveway, I went straight inside and curled up on the couch, numb. My husband Jake came home not long after, and the moment I told him what had happened, his face shifted from confusion to anger in seconds. He paced around the room, cursing under his breath, and then grabbed his phone to text his mother. He kept it short but sharp, asking why I was treated that way and demanding an explanation. But no reply ever came. Not that night. Not the next day. Just more silence from the people who claimed to be family. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was cruel. And it left a mark that not even Jake's anger or support could undo. Just when I thought the quiet rejection had run its course, there came one more blow that hit even harder. The so-called family party that was planned just a few days before the wedding. Jake received the invitation directly, a neat little card slipped into an envelope with the same scripted font they had used for the rest of the wedding stationery. My name wasn't on it. No +1. No mention of me at all. When he asked about it, he was told, very matter-of-factly, that the bride and groom had decided this event would be intimate, and that only people specifically invited by them should attend. No unexpected guests, they had said, like someone slipping in unnoticed might ruin their perfect tableau. Jake was furious, but I asked him to go anyway, partly because I wanted to believe this was just more tone-deaf wedding etiquette nonsense and not another deliberate exclusion. But when he came back that night, he looked pale and quiet, and it took him a while before he finally told me why. His ex was there. She hadn't received an official invitation either, at least not that he knew of, but Karen had made sure she was there, hugging people, sipping wine, seated like part of the family. My absence hadn't been about space or formality. It had been personal. Calculated. They hadn't just excluded me, they had replaced me. That moment was the final crack in whatever fragile hope I had left of mending things or believing this was all just a misunderstanding. I didn't even know that Amber had ever met Jake's ex, let alone well enough to invite her to something labeled as a family gathering. It felt like a message carved in stone. You are not wanted here, but she is. Whether it was Karen's doing or Amber's or both, it didn't matter anymore. It was too much. Too pointed. Too cruel. Up until then, despite everything, the lack of communication, the silence, the awkward phone call from a bridesmaid, I was still holding on to the belief that I would do my part and follow through with the cake. I told myself I'd honor my word because I didn't want to stoop to their level. But sitting alone in the kitchen, thinking about that party and how they had made space for someone from Jake's past while pushing me further into the shadows, all that commitment dissolved into something bitter and sharp. The truth was, I didn't want to help anymore. I didn't want to bake for people who had gone out of their way to humiliate me. My desire to be gracious, to be the bigger person, to show up with kindness, they had burned all of that down without saying a single word to my face. In the end, I couldn't bring myself to completely walk away, but not for their sake. I thought about Jake's niece, the sweet girl who had hugged me every time we met and once told me she loved my baking more than store-bought cake. I pictured her in that flower girl dress, surrounded by trays of food she couldn't eat, and my heart cracked open a little. So I made a quiet choice. Instead of a grand display of cakes, I baked a dozen small gluten-free and vegan cupcakes, carefully frosted and decorated just for her. It wasn't for Amber or Karen or anyone who had pushed me to the sidelines. It was for a child who deserved at least one thing to be joyful that day. I sent Karen a message telling her that I would not be making the cakes as originally planned. I explained, clearly and politely, that I'd be providing only the cupcakes and that if they still wanted them, I needed the ingredients and full payment up front. No favors. No last-minute panic. Just a transaction. She didn't respond right away, and I figured she might just ignore me altogether, but 2 days before the wedding, a box of ingredients showed up at my door along with a begrudging payment. Venmo'd, without a message. No thank you, no apology, not even a confirmation. Just the bare minimum, barely disguised. I took it as their version of surrender, or at least acknowledgement that they had backed themselves into a corner and had no one else to ask. And I baked those cupcakes with care, but without 1 ounce of love left for any of them. When I arrived at the venue, carrying the carefully boxed cupcakes I had stayed up late to decorate, I tried to remind myself that this wasn't about them. It was for Jake's niece, for that small moment when she'd get to enjoy something sweet and safe just like everyone else. I walked into the reception hall and made my way to the dessert table, only to stop cold. The entire table was already full, overflowing actually, with polished, professionally arranged pastries and cakes from a well-known local gluten-free bakery. Labels, tiered stands, matching ribbons. Every item coordinated with the wedding colors, perfectly curated like a spread from a magazine shoot. I stood there for a few seconds, holding my plain white box with trembling hands, feeling the heat rise behind my eyes. No one had told me they'd ordered from somewhere else. No one had said, "Don't bother," or "We've made other arrangements." My cupcakes weren't just forgotten, they were never wanted in the first place. I felt like an afterthought, a placeholder for when they didn't have a backup plan. And now that they did, I was invisible again. There was no room for what I made. No space cleared. No gesture of gratitude or even acknowledgement. I hovered awkwardly by the table, unsure of what to do, and finally set the box quietly on the far corner, where it looked painfully out of place. I turned away quickly, blinking hard, forcing myself not to cry right there in front of all these polished strangers. It wasn't just a table of desserts. It was a mirror of how I had been treated throughout the entire wedding, unnecessary, inconvenient, and silently pushed aside. Just when I thought the quiet humiliation of the dessert table was behind us, we walked toward the reception area and saw the seating chart. Jake scanned the list first and I watched the color drain from his face in real time. His jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitch, and he turned to me with a stunned expression, whispering, "You're not going to believe this." I leaned in, confused, until he pointed to our names on the chart, both of them printed neatly under one table number, directly across from a name we had only ever said with bitterness and caution. We had been seated with his biological father. The man Jake hadn't spoken to in years. The man who abandoned him and his mother, who had resurfaced briefly only to cause damage, and who Jake had specifically asked not to be invited to our own wedding. The man who represented everything broken about his childhood. I felt sick. He had made it clear in more than one conversation that he never wanted to see that man again, ever. And yet, here we were, seated across from him as if we were catching up with distant relatives over wine and polite conversation. It wasn't just oversight. It was something deeper, more pointed, another invisible shove that said, "This isn't your space. Your boundaries don't matter here." I could feel Jake's rage simmering under the surface, the kind that doesn't explode but poisons every second of presence. We hadn't even sat down yet, and the entire evening was already shattered. And as if the seating arrangement hadn't already knocked the air out of us, our eyes drifted toward the head table, where the bride and groom and their closest circle were seated, all glowing under warm lighting and soft music. And there, nestled comfortably among them, was her, Jake's ex. Not seated quietly at the far end or tucked among acquaintances, but right there at the heart of it all, drinking and laughing like she belonged more than we ever had. She had a wine glass in her hand, but it wasn't just any glass. It was etched with script lettering, personalized and elegant, reading, "My drinks are paid for by the newlyweds." We stared stunned. No one had ever mentioned that custom glasses were being made. We had never even heard of it. There was no heads up, no casual mention, no offer to include us. We weren't asked for preferences, names, nothing. It was as if those glasses, and whatever thoughtfulness they symbolized, had been reserved only for those they deemed worthy. And somehow, unbelievably, that included Jake's ex. Jake stood completely still beside me, fists clenched, his expression locked in something between disbelief and fury. I could feel my own chest tightening, the weight of it all collecting in my throat. After everything, after the snubbing, the phone call, the cupcakes, the seating, with his estranged father no less, they had made sure that the woman he had moved on from, the woman who had broken his heart years ago, had a seat of honor and a glass that practically screamed, "You matter here." And us? We didn't even exist in their narrative. Not as family. Not as guests. Not even as an afterthought. Jake's breathing grew shallow, and I could see the way his hands trembled slightly as he tried to keep his composure, blinking fast like he was trying to push back everything at once. The betrayal, the humiliation, the pain that had been piling up since the moment we stepped into that wedding. He didn't say much, but I could feel the storm inside him building to the point where it wasn't just emotional anymore, it was physical, something that threatened to take over completely. I leaned in close and whispered, "Let's get out of here," and without waiting for anyone's gaze to fall on us, I led him out of the hall and into the quiet refuge of the hotel's side corridor. We walked in silence and then descended to the bar in the lobby, a dim and quieter space where the music was mellow and no one cared about place cards or seating charts. Behind the bar was an old friend of mine from college who had no idea what kind of chaos we had just escaped. But when she saw the look on our faces, she immediately dropped the formal tone and ushered us to a quiet corner, asking what happened. We told her everything, slowly at first, then spilling it all out, and she just listened, nodding, her hands moving without hesitation to pour drinks we didn't even ask for. She made us laugh once, with something ridiculous about weddings being a magnet for dysfunction, and somehow that cracked open a little bit of space where the air felt easier to breathe. After a drink or two, Jake was finally beginning to settle. His shoulders weren't so tight and his voice had come back, though still low and clipped. I told him to stay put while I went to check something that had been gnawing at me since we left. That man, his biological father. I needed to know if he was still there, still seated at the table meant for family, while the real family, the one Jake and I built for ourselves, had been pushed aside. So I stood up, smoothed my dress and made my way quietly back toward the hall, every step heavier than the last. We eventually made our way back, not because we wanted to salvage the evening, but because we didn't want them to think they had succeeded in driving us away completely. We skipped our assigned table, obviously, and found 2 empty seats with a couple who used to babysit Jake when he was a kid, familiar faces in a sea of cold shoulders. They greeted us kindly, no forced smiles, just genuine warmth, like we were actually supposed to be there. It was the first moment all day that felt remotely safe. I pulled out the box of cupcakes I had brought, the ones no one had made room for, and gently handed one to Jake's niece. She lit up immediately, delighted, clutching it like it was something magical, and seeing her happy, if only for a few minutes, made all the heartache slightly more bearable. The rest of the cupcakes, the ones I had labored over in quiet defiance, I offered to the bartenders. They had been kind to us earlier, listening without judgment, treating us like people instead of burdens or afterthoughts. Their gratitude was immediate, and not just the polite kind. They actually smiled, asked what ingredients I'd used, and said they wished the dessert table had looked more like this. It wasn't much. A few good people in a room full of bruising silence. But for that hour, we carved out a corner of the night that belonged to us, untouched by all the pettiness and cruelty. And that was something. Toward the end of the evening, when most of the dancing had moved into awkward sways and people were too tired or too tipsy to pretend anymore, Karen approached me. She looked composed as always, but there was a strange tightness in her expression, like she had rehearsed what she wanted to say a dozen times and still wasn't sure how to deliver it. She leaned in slightly and said, with a gentle tone that didn't quite reach her eyes, "I was wondering, do you think we could go back to how things used to be?" I stood there, looking at the woman who had, piece by piece, excluded me from nearly every part of this celebration. The same woman who had dismissed me, ignored my messages, questioned my worth, and stood by while others humiliated me. I took a slow breath, steady and full, and said quietly but clearly, "This really isn't the time or place for that." I held her gaze and added, "But thank you for helping me understand exactly where I stand in this family." And then I turned away, not with anger, but with clarity. It wasn't about revenge or bitterness anymore. It was about finally seeing the truth, and choosing to stop chasing a place where I was never truly wanted. After the wedding, the silence settled in like a thick fog, dense, quiet, and oddly peaceful. We didn't make a decision to cut them off, but we also didn't chase after people who had made it painfully clear that we were disposable. Amber never reached out. Not a single message, not even a polite thank you or a fake check-in. She vanished from our lives with the same dismissiveness she had shown throughout her wedding. Karen, on the other hand, still sends the occasional message. They're never full sentences, never true conversations, just vague attempts draped in guilt like, "I'm hurting too," or, "Let's keep the family together," as if those fragments could undo what had been said and done. But there are no apologies. No ownership. Not once has she acknowledged how she treated us, how she allowed others to do the same, or how she stood by while her son was humiliated in front of people who were supposed to be family. And despite all that, I feel strangely light. Because I know with full certainty that I did everything I could. I showed up, I communicated, I baked, I tried. And still I was pushed out. So now I am done. This won't happen again. I've closed the door gently, not with bitterness but with finality. Some families are built through blood, others through love. And from now on, I will choose the ones who choose me back.